Story 1. My grandfather's entire life he had a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, he would be walking down a long dark hallway, turn to the right, open a door, and see something terrible. He'd always wake up before seeing what it was. In his 40s, he, his wife, my dad, and my aunt were on vacation. They booked the hotel at the last minute, so they ended up having to get 2 rooms with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. My dad wakes up around 3 a.m. and can automatically tell something's not right. He calls out in the darkness, "Mom?" No response. He turns on the bedside light. "Mom?" he says, a little louder this time. Still no response. Getting worried, he slides out of bed and shakes his mother. She doesn't wake up. My dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandfather's room and started banging on the door. My grandpa worriedly opens the door, and my dad shouts something's wrong with Mom. He leads him down the hallway. A long hallway. To the last door on the right. My grandfather reaches the door, turns to left, and sees his wife dead in bed. Heart attack. He never had the dream again. Story 2. One of my friends had a job in the hospital looking after patients, making beds etc. I heard he randomly quit his job, and wouldn't talk to anyone about it. I bring some beers over to his house and try to see if I can get him talking. He's a total emotional wreck. Finally get him to talk, and he says that he was working one night in the hospital when he heard a nurse shouting for help because someone was going into cardiac arrest. He runs down a hallway and a man runs towards him. The man shouts, "Where's the exit?" My friend points to the exit, then runs into the room with the man going into cardiac arrest, only to see it's the exact same person who ran past him in the hallway. He died in front of his eyes. Story 3. When I was around 7, my grandmother took care of a baby whose mother was an alcoholic and drug addict. This woman would bring her child, let's call him Timmy, to my grandmother's house and leave him there for months at a time. Needless to say, our family became very attached and thought of him as part of the family. His mother came to get him one night and her drunk boyfriend flips the car. Timmy was in a coma for about 3 or 4 days. One night my older brother wakes everyone in the house up screaming and crying, saying that Timmy is dead. Once my parents get him calmed down, he tells them that Timmy came into his room crying, saying that he has to leave but he is scared and wants my brother to come with him. While my parents are trying to convince my brother that it was just a dream, the phone rings and it is my uncle calling from the hospital to inform us that Timmy had died. This happened over 30 years ago, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Story 4. I live near a camp that I used to attend as a child. When I was 7, there was a counselor at the camp who was German. The camp has a very large staff exchange program with many different countries. Counselor said he was incredibly agile, and during staff-only campfires he would catch, skin, and eat live rabbits. He could also do this crazy sleeper hold move. It essentially was a strangling move that knocked you out for a few seconds, you came to, and were fine a minute later. I saw him do it on a counselor once. The guy was out for about 10 seconds. He was forbidden to do it after that. However, kids got curious and started asking him to do the move. He would do it in secret, but he would increase the severity of his holds, which would in turn keep the kid knocked out for a longer period of time. One day, a camper went missing. He wasn't in his bunk, despite going to bed with his cabin that night. They did a camp-wide search, keeping us all on the soccer field for about 2 hours. The counselors had to start searching the water. They found his body under the sailing dock, completely out cold. He was alive, but unconscious. He had the strangle marks around his neck. Everyone knew who it was. They arrested the German guy, and deported him back to Germany. Turns out they never even sent an exchange counselor. Nobody knew who he was. Story 5. My 4-year-old daughter was supposedly asleep when I heard noise coming from her upstairs bedroom. I tried to listen but could not make out what was being said. I approached the room, and she stopped talking. Thinking I alarmed her, I went into the room. At the time she was sharing it with her 3-year-old sister. I walked in and saw the 4-year-old sitting up in bed. I smiled and said, "Is everything okay?" She said fine, but her sister said they were keeping her up. I asked who? My 4-year-old said sorry but that she was talking. When I asked her who she was talking to, my 3-year-old sat up and said, "The girl in the window, she said you were coming." I was freaked out, but I asked who the girl was and they both said a girl comes and stands in front of the window at night and talks to them. Not knowing what to say, I said okay, tucked them in and hung around outside their door. The next day I asked about the girl. They said she came back but was mad. I waited a few days and asked again. My 4-year-old said the girl in the window was still mad. I forgot about it for about a week, when my wife said, "Who are the girls talking to upstairs?" Freaked out I ran upstairs and both girls were sitting under the window looking up. They turned and looked at me and asked if I wanted to meet the girl. When they turned around, disappointed, they said the girl left. It has been about 5 years since and I have not heard about the girl in the window since then. Story 6. My mom, grandparents, aunt and uncles and several of their neighbors all swear they saw a UFO hover over my grandparents' house in the late 1960s. They said it just hung over the backyard, silently spinning, expect for a faint whizzing sound for a minute or two with all sorts of colors in a ring. My mom and grandma said they remember the television and radio in the living room turning on full blast, getting transmissions and broadcasts from other countries and other languages, and appliances in the kitchen were rattling. My uncle said it was hanging right outside his bedroom window on the top floor, and that he was too scared to move, just stood by his window, staring. Story 7. When my cousin was around 8 years old, his room was in the basement. The basement level was half underground and half above ground. His room had a window and his bed was right next to the window. One night, out of the blue, he wakes up and opens his eyes and there's a man crouched right outside the window just staring at him. He didn't know what to do, so he just froze for a second, then turned over in bed and turned his back to the guy and eventually fell asleep. This went on for a while. On random nights the stranger would come and stare at him through the window. Sometimes he would actually tap on the glass with his finger. On the opposite wall of the window was a mirror, so one night when my cousin noticed the stranger was there, and he turned over in bed so as to not have to look at the guy, the stranger shined a flashlight and bounced the beam off the mirror to illuminate my cousin's face as if to say, "I can still see you." But the worst part was this. One night the stranger finally got bold and began to push on the window to see if it would open, but luckily the window was locked. To this day my cousin has no idea who the guy was or what he wanted, or what he would have done had the window been unlocked that night. And to this day he still has not told his parents about it. Story 8. This one happened to my parents about 20 years ago now. Both of them were driving out to Death Valley to a hotel for a weekend in the winter time, and they had left late in the day and were going to arrive at the hotel at night. The hotel was about 30 minutes outside of the actual Death Valley town center, and when they finally found the place, it was completely abandoned. My mom gets spooked easily and didn't want to go and look, but my dad's into that sort of shit and got out of the car. Right after he walks around the back of the building to look around, a man approaches my mother's side of the car. He claims his motorcycle broke down, and that he delivers newspapers to Death Valley. My mom looks around, sees no motorcycle anywhere. And this hotel had nothing near it, not one building. This guy was begging my mom to come get the newspapers, and take them to a hotel in town, otherwise he'd lose his job. He had the stack in his hands, and wanted her to open the door so that he could give them to her. My mom's getting serious vibes from this guy now and refuses, locks all the doors and tells him to go away. He continues to beg. Finally my dad comes around the corner, and the guy panics a bit and just hands them over to my dad quickly and leaves. They drive off, and they spot the guy start walking off, into the desert. They finally get to the hotel to deliver the papers, and end up booking a room there. When they hand over the newspapers, the lady at the desk tells them they don't get any newspapers delivered to the hotel. My parents open up the stack and look at the front page. It's a newspaper from 1954. Story 9. My parents told me this story many times. They firmly believe it happened exactly as I am about to tell it. My parents, my older brother and I were going apple picking. My parents decided they wanted to go to a different orchard this year than the one they have been going to for years, so off we went. We apparently stopped for gas at this old-time convenience store. While my dad was filling the tank, my mom said she went in and looked around for some snacks, but she said everything in the store looked old but fresh. Like, snacks from another era or whatever. So she didn't buy anything, but chatted with an elderly clerk behind the counter while paying for the gas. So, we leave that store and continue on to have an apparently amazing day picking lovely Granny Smiths and whatnot. On our way home, my dad stopped to get gas at the same convenience store that we had stopped at on our way to the orchard. But all was not as it seems. The convenience store was boarded up and looked like it had been abandoned for quite a long time. So my dad drove to the Sunoco at a rest stop a few miles down the road to get gas. My dad, being the ever-talkative guy, wound up in conversation with an older fellow working at the Sunoco. Turns out, that convenience store had been abandoned for over 50 years when the owner, an elderly gentleman perfectly described as the gentleman my mom had chatted with, was shot and killed during a robbery. I'm 32 now and certainly don't believe the story, but my parents swear by it 100%. They told me they did not say a single word the entire drive home, they were so freaked out. Story 10. I live in a really rural place, so it's not uncommon to have really long stretches of road with absolutely no civilization at all. No lights, no other cars, no nothing for miles and miles. One night, my friend was driving back from a bonfire party in the desert when she said she just saw what looked like a guy walking along the side of the road. She could see him moving way up ahead of her, and as she got closer, she started to notice that the way he was moving was very unusual. His arms seemed too long and she described his gait to me as nothing she'd ever seen a human being do. She said it was like he was constantly staggering, but never falling over. She told me that as she got close enough to pass him, she just knew that she didn't want to see this person/thing's face. She turned her rearview mirror away from her, drove by as fast as she could, and didn't look back. She called me later to tell me about this. She was actually really creeped out, because the person/thing had been heading in the direction of our town. Story 11. When I was around 17, one of my friends lived in a house about 2 miles outside of the town my friends and I lived in. It was right next to a freeway and had a large amount of land attached to it. His parents had gone on holiday and we were planning on having a small party at his house. A few of us met up in the village and walked through the country roads up to his house, which took about 30 minutes. When we got there we found 2 police cars parked in the drive. We all thought that the party had started and for whatever reason the cops had been called. Turns out that the friend who lived there had been eating dinner waiting for people to turn up when he noticed someone standing at the bottom of the garden just out of range of the porch light, watching him. Thinking it was one of us messing with him, he slipped out the side door in an attempt to get behind whoever it was and surprise them instead. After sneaking around and not being able to find the person, he headed back expecting us to be there waiting, only to look through the kitchen window and see an unknown man sat in his kitchen finishing the dinner he had been eating. Apparently he looked dirty, unkempt and basically like a tramp. My friend got so scared he ran a mile to his nearest neighbor and called the police. When they turned up they searched the house and property with dogs but couldn't find anyone.